Welcome to part 2 in our orbiter video tutorial series. This is Tex, and in this part we're going to focus on launching the Delta glider into orbit with the ultimate goal of reaching ISS. In the coming parts we will cover things like aligning the orbital plane, synchronizing the orbit, and docking with ISS. To begin, I should mention, if you have not seen it already, I highly recommend checking out part 1. I'll put a link to it somewhere here in the video box for you to click on, and it does cover all of the orbital elements, breakdown on the orbit MFD, and really explains how orbital mechanics work with an orbiter. This will be really helpful for you to understand the concepts of orbiter and how spaceflight works. So I'm going to use the Delta glider in the Delta glider folder. I'm going to use the generic scenario called Cape Canaveral. I should also mention that I do have my parameters set for all of my realism settings are on. As a beginner, you may want to consider disabling non-spherical gravity sources. It will make your orbit fluctuate a little bit. It just makes it a little bit more challenging, but it's not terrible. So you can try to turn that off if you're having trouble, but otherwise, everything else I would recommend having all of that on. So let's go here. I'm going to launch this scenario. And let me also mention that this scenario actually starts you out on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. And the problem with that is that the Delta glider is not capable of doing a vertical takeoff from a launch pad while holding enough fuel on board to reach orbital velocity from the Earth, that is. So what I have done is I've actually used the scenario editor to move the Delta glider over to the runway. And I also filled the propellant up to about halfway, which is more than enough to reach orbit and get to ISS and probably even get back home too. So I would suggest if you want to use this scenario, you can use the scenario editor to do the same, or just if you have another scenario with the Delta glider on the runway at Cape Canaveral, that would work as well if you want to follow along. So to begin with, the first thing I want to do is I want to find out when a launch window is, because we're going to go to ISS. So let's pull up the map MFD over here. Let's go ahead and target ISS. I also like to press display and change orbit lines from ground track to orbit plane and press OK. And let's press the track button that will center the map on our location, and we can zoom in. Now what we're looking at here is to determine a launch window, we want to look at ISS's orbital plane, which is indicated by this yellow line right here. We're not actually concerned about where ISS itself is. You can see on the map that ISS is actually over here, somewhere over the South Atlantic. It really does not matter where ISS actually is. What we're concerned about is its orbital plane. So we have two possible launch headings, or two launch windows. We have one that is approaching now, and then we have another one as this line over here comes around. Now let me explain that. You have ISS that's orbiting the Earth, and meanwhile the Earth is rotating. So if I speed time up, you will see that it almost appears that ISS's orbital line here is traversing across the landscape. But of course that's happening because the Earth is rotating beneath it. So our launch window occurs when ISS's orbital line here, its orbital plane, is directly over your launch site. But you don't want to wait until it's directly over to actually launch, because you need to give yourself enough time to reach orbital velocity. So the key here is understanding when to launch and what heading to launch in. Now you can see that we just passed through a launch window, and ISS would have been heading in a southeasterly launch, or a southeasterly heading as it crossed over KSC. So the next launch window, if I speed time up, you can see its orbital plane is approaching Cape Canaveral. I'll zoom in a little bit. And you can see as ISS would be traversing its orbital plane across our launch site, in this configuration, it would be heading in a northeasterly heading. So generally speaking, without giving you an exact number, we know that due north is 0 degrees and due east is 90 degrees. So if you split that, that's 45 degrees. So with this current launch window approaching, we could just take off into a heading of 45 degrees and our orbital plane would be pretty close to ISS's by the time we reach orbit. If we were to just take off into at any point, if we were to just take off and turn to a heading of due east, 90 degrees, our orbital plane would look just like this, as you see it here. So that would be if we launched into a due east. And you can see that that would not be aligned with ISS. To have your orbital plane aligned with ISS, our orbital plane would be laying directly over ISS's orbital plane. So by trying to align that during the launch, we could save ourselves a lot of fuel later on once we're in orbit. So generally speaking, I think it's about 42.5 degrees when it's a northeast launch window. I might be mistaken on that one, but I know for sure the southeast launch window is 136. I usually just go for 137 degrees. But the space shuttle only launches in this launch window because when the space shuttle launches, when it gets rid of its solid rocket boosters, they land down here in the Atlantic where they can be recovered in U.S. waters. If you were to do a southeast launch heading, let me speed time up. You can see obviously the space shuttle would be launching this way, and so its boosters would not fall down into U.S. waters. So that's one big reason. The other reason is because of abort options to be able to land at bases in Europe. So we're going to go for this launch window. And it's also daytime, which is convenient. But that really doesn't matter. So we know that with this launch window approaching, we're going to be launching into a southeast heading at 137 degrees, but we need to know exactly when to launch. So to figure that out, we're going to pull up the Aligned Planes MFD and target ISS. Okay, so in the next tutorial, we will cover this whole MFD in depth. But the only thing that we're going to concern ourselves right now while we're on the ground is TN. That is time to node. And that's counting down in time in seconds until ISS's orbital plane is directly over our launch site. Now, again, we don't want to wait until it's directly over our launch site. So with the Delta glider, I find that usually when TN reaches about 300 seconds or maybe just slightly under 300 seconds, maybe like 290, is the perfect time to go. But if you wait until TN is 300 seconds and with this launch window approaching and you take off, turn to a heading of 137 degrees, your orbital plane is going to be pretty darn close. So just doing those two things right there is going to save you a lot of fuel and even time, because you're not going to have to take the time to do such a drastic orbital plane alignment in orbit. So okay, so basically we are ready to go. We just need to speed time up until TN reaches about 300 seconds. So we'll be careful because it'll come pretty quickly. So be careful not to pass it. All right, we're pretty close here. There we go. There's 300 seconds. We're at normal time. So what I'm going to do is go full power. Actually, let's turn off our rotational thrusters. We don't need those right now in the atmosphere. Pull back. Pull back on the throttle once we get airborne. Raise our gear. Turn to a heading of 137 degrees. Okay. Now I'm going to pitch up to around 50 or 60 degrees up here and go back to full power. And I'm going to hold the nose up until we get up above 10 kilometers in altitude. Now the key here is that you don't want to hold the nose up forever, and that's probably the biggest mistake that I see new people to orbiter make, is they try and hold the nose up for incredibly too long, and then they climb completely out of the atmosphere, and then you're totally reliant on your main engines to get you into orbit. The Delta glider has wings, so we want to utilize those wings by generating lift in the atmosphere to help us climb up out of it. But as you get up into the thinner atmosphere, there's less air molecules to collide with the wings and generate the lift you need. So the thinner the air is, the higher in altitude you go, the more velocity you need, the more forward, the more tangential velocity you need in order to experience any lift or any effect from those air molecules colliding with the spacecraft. So I'm trying to gently lower the nose. It's a little difficult to narrate this with a microphone in front of me, joystick and everything else, but you get the idea. Basically, we get up through the thickest part of the atmosphere, 10-15 kilometers, and nose down to roughly around 20 degrees here, and begin building up our tangential velocity. And again, we're holding a heading around 137 degrees to try and get our plane aligned with ISS at the same time. So as we're climbing up through the atmosphere here, I'll talk you through some of the things on the surface MFD. You can change your airspeed reference here a couple of places. You have indicated airspeed right there, true airspeed by clicking that. Ground speed is what is usually on by default, and orbital speed, which is the same thing as the velocity readout on the orbit MFD. We'll go back to ground speed. So we have our speed indicator here, the speed tape, and below that is the acceleration tape. That's basically how fast your speed is changing. Over here you have your current altitude listed in kilometers. Next to that is the vertical speed tape. Below that is the vertical acceleration tape, so that's how quickly your vertical speed, the rate of your vertical speed is changing. You have angle of attack here. And over here you have some atmospheric data. You have things like outside air temperature listed in Kelvin. You have the Mach number, so we're currently just going over Mach 5. Static, let's see, I think that is static pressure. Is it static pressure? I lost my place. It is... Yes, it is. It is static pressure. Of course it would be. You also have dynamic pressure here, and DNS is atmospheric density. So these are all, of course, related to atmospheric parameters. As we climb up out of the atmosphere, you can see that the dynamic pressure, or the atmospheric density rather, is decreasing. Naturally, of course it would. So that pretty much covers the surface MFD. I guess down here also you have equatorial position. So there's a lot of useful information there, and I like to use that during the launch. Some people don't, but and this is the affiliate. Oh God, I forgot what it's called. Essentially, you can think of it like almost like apoapsis, which is the highest point of your altitude. So you can see it's coming down a little bit, and when it reaches here and starts dropping below, then that means that you're descending, and currently we're climbing. So but we always want to watch our velocity vector. We want to make sure that our velocity vector is always above the horizon line. Obviously we always want to be climbing, but really at this point you can see we're already at 56 kilometers in altitude. I'm not climbing drastically. I'm just doing a nice slow climb through the atmosphere, utilizing lift from the wings as our ground speed, as our velocity increases over here. Now also, this whole time I want to be looking at the aligned plane MFD. What I'm looking at is relative inclination. That is our inclination relative to ISS's. Ideally we want to try and get this on 0. You won't get it perfectly on 0, but as close as you can throughout the launch. And by doing that, you're going to minimize how much fuel you need once you get into orbit to align your plane with ISS. Now you can see it's hit near 0, and as it continues to fall, ideally you want to see it continue to fall. If you start to see it increase, then you need to yaw either right or left, whichever direction it takes, to stop that increase and bring it back down. You want to always see it either dropping or reaching its lowest possible point. Now we're pretty high up in the atmosphere now. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my rotational thrusters, which will give me a little bit more control. And let's level off, kill rotation. Okay, so now we can see our relative inclination here is about reaching as low as it can, and the line of nodes, this line between the ascending and the descending node, it's actually kind of spinning around on our position here because it's reaching its lowest possible point. So what I want to do is yaw to the left or the right, whichever way it takes, and the left was doing it. I want to try and keep a 90-degree angle between my positional line here and the line of nodes. That's going to ensure that I keep relative inclination as low as possible for the remainder of the launch. So I'm going to yaw a little bit more to the left and try and keep a 90-degree angle there as best as possible. Okay, so you can see that we're still climbing a little bit, but very slowly. We're at 63 kilometers. We're looking pretty good here. Let's go ahead and open the Orbit MFD over here. And let's change the projection from ecliptic to ship. And let's press the distance button so that we get our altitude readout in kilometers above the surface. And we also get our apoapsis and our periapsis readout in kilometers above the surface. So it looks like this is probably the lowest that our relative inclination is going to get, and quite frankly, I consider that great. So you may have a little trouble getting it that low initially until you just practice it, but you get the idea about timing it with the launch window. It all makes a big difference. So you can see it actually climbed up just a little bit, so let's try to yaw a little bit more, and that's not working, so let's yaw more this way and stop that from happening. So it looks like right around there, and that's good enough. So we are almost in orbit now. What we want to be watching, as you see, our orbit here is currently still below the surface of the Earth on the other side. This is our location here. We want to be watching it as it raises up above the gray line here, the gray circle, the surface of the Earth. We want to be watching our apoapsis number. Currently our apoapsis is actually here, but you can see it sliding over here as it raises up. The key here is if we target ISS, you can see it. ISS's altitude is around 369 to 381 kilometers. So we want to try and shut down when our apoapsis reaches about 360, 381. While I was talking, that actually happened. We passed it a little bit. Let me turn that off. You can see our apoapsis listed here is at 397 kilometers. So I missed it by a little bit. It's not terrible. ISS's apoapsis, the highest part of its orbit is 382 kilometers. But that's okay. We're not too far off. It's a lot easier to do these things when I'm not having to narrate it and explain things as they're happening. But you get the idea. So if I press mode, let me just go ahead and hit no target just to get rid of ISS's data for right now. But you can use that information to determine when you need to have main engine cut off, so that your altitude is pretty close to ISS's. So all we need to do now is we need to coast around to our apoapsis and do a prograde burn to circularize the orbit. Currently we are in an unstable orbit because as we coast around to our apoapsis, if we didn't do a burn up over here, if we didn't do a prograde burn right here to raise our orbit altitude on this side, you can clearly see it is below the surface of the Earth over here. So we would most definitely burn up as we came back around over here and fall back into the atmosphere. So let me just very carefully speed time up, kill rotation. And you can see the vessel was still moving around just a little bit there because we were still getting a little bit of the atmospheric effect, but we're pretty much out of it now. We're at 188 kilometers in altitude. I'm going to press the H button twice to open to change over to the orbit HUD, and we'll use this for the remainder of our time in orbit here. Let's go ahead and face prograde. And once the vessel settles down, I'll turn prograde autopilot off. And let me speed time up, and we're going to coast around to apoapsis up here and circularize the orbit, and that will complete this tutorial. So as we approach, we're getting pretty close. Let's go ahead and engage the prograde autopilot. And what we're looking at is we're looking at APT. This is our time counting down in seconds until we reach apoapsis. Essentially, you want to do your burn when APT is about half of the time it takes to do the burn. We don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but this is probably close enough. We have 8 seconds. So I'm burning with my main engines, and I'm watching eccentricity right here. In order to get a circular orbit, we want to get that as close to 0 as we can. And that is really good enough. So there you have it. That is how you get into orbit. We are now in a stable orbit. Our altitude is a little higher than ISS's, but it's really not a big deal because we're going to have to do things like align the orbital plane and then establish a rendezvous point and synchronize our orbits in order to reach ISS. So that concludes this tutorial. I hope you guys liked it. Be sure to like the video, leave me a comment, subscribe for updates and whatnot. And I sure appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you on the next one.